Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the University of St. Francis and to the third in the lectures of the annual lecture series from the Department of Philosophy and Theology, of which I am the chairman, Adam DeVille. I'm pleased to welcome you all on this Sunday afternoon, and thank you for your patience. We had a room situation in which we were double booked just very briefly, so thank you for bearing with us. Welcome to this lecture, in which we'll hear from Dr. Earl Comfer, longtime full professor here at the university until June, chairman of the Department of Philosophy and Theology, and then in June there was a series of musical chairs, as it were, and Earl has been made acting dean of the School of Arts and Sciences for this academic year. His lecture this afternoon ties in with the feast day in the Western Church of the Immaculate Conception of the Mother of God. If you know anything of the history of that, you know that it was a long and somewhat controverted discussion, and leading to finally a declaration in the 19th century in which Franciscan scholars were of paramount importance. And so we're going to hear about one of those Franciscans, in particular, John Duns Scotus. I will be back up here at the end if people want for a discussion, question and answer. I can bring the microphone around. And I'll just flag one thing before I turn it over to Earl. As I mentioned, this is the third in the series. We do one public lecture roughly every 6 weeks. The next one will be after Christmas, January 12th, 3 o'clock. Not here this time, but across the street in the North Campus. And Sister Felicity Dorset will be speaking on the 5 feasts of the child Jesus. So if you're around after Christmas, but still in the Christmas season, and you want to come and hear about those feasts, please come 3 o'clock on the 12th of January. Again, thank you for your patience, and I will turn it over to Dr. Comfer.
Well, good afternoon, good people.
Good afternoon.
I am a dunce. Those who are students or devotees of John Duns Scotus often are referred to as dunces. Back in the 15th century, that was really a put-down term by almost anyone who could not stand some of what he stood for. But I proudly wear that label. To this particular Franciscan friar, we owe a great deal. The Feast of the Immaculate Conception, of Mary's conception, is normally held on December 8th. Because of the season, that has been deferred until tomorrow this year. And I do not know if it's a day of obligation, but normally it has been. It's exam week, so we should start with a test. And do not be surprised if you do not get this right. About half of the Catholic population gets it wrong, and better than half the non-Catholic population gets it wrong. The term, the Immaculate Conception, is best described as a belief that A, Jesus was free of personal and original sin from the time of his conception, or B, Mary conceived Jesus without sex, or C, that Mary conceived Jesus without sinning, or D, that Mary was free of personal and original sin, or E, that Mary was still a virgin after conceiving Jesus. The answer is D. Good. Many, many folks will get that wrong, and for, I think, a number of reasons. It's well known by catechists that this is often a difficulty, that people do not have a correct understanding of this. In fact, I've had several people in the last 3 or 4 weeks tell me they heard definitively from a Catholic that it meant that Mary was virgin, or that Jesus had never sinned, or that he was born without the effects of original sin. Those are common misunderstandings, misconstruals of what this very, very ancient doctrine really says. And I'm not surprised, although I was surprised for quite some time as to why that should be the case. And it finally dawned on me one December 8th at Mass why it is so often mistaken. This is the gospel for tomorrow. Those of us who attend Mass tomorrow on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception will hear these words from Luke. The angel Gabriel was sent from God to a town of Galilee called Nazareth to a virgin betrothed to a man named Joseph of the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. And coming to her, he said, "Hail, full of grace, the Lord is with you." But she was greatly troubled at what was said and pondered what sort of greeting this might be. Then the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. Behold, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you shall name him Jesus. He will be great and will be called Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give him the throne of David, his father, and he will rule over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end." But Mary said to the angel, "How can this be, since I have no relations with a man?" And the angel said to her in reply, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child to be born will be called Holy, the Son of God. And behold, Elizabeth, your relative, has also conceived a son in her old age, and this is the 6th month for her, who was called barren, for nothing will be impossible for God." Mary said, "Behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord. Be it done to me according to your word." And then the angel departed from her. This is a wonderful passage for exegesis. It is amazing in the complexity of this passage, unlike some of what we see elsewhere in Luke. The scene is called the Annunciation, but it has its own feast in our calendar on March 25th. It is this scene that we reflect on in the first of the joyful mysteries of the Rosary. What is announced in this passage is that Mary will conceive Jesus by the power of the Holy Spirit. So the attentive listener understandably is thinking of Jesus' conception by this young virgin mother. Further, the biblical plot turns on a dramatic issue of the exceptional way that this conception is going to occur without the involvement of a male. The listener could possibly be redirected by the homily to consider the moment of Mary's conception, which is what the feast is about. But even the most effective preacher, I would guess, will have a difficult time competing with the gospel setting. The gospel reading seems to speak quite clearly about Jesus' conception, not Mary's. The problem for this feast is to find a gospel passage talking about her conception will be done in vain because it's not there. The first reading tomorrow is going to be a reading from chapter 3 in Genesis, the discussion of the fall. That does put us into a kind of a proper mode for where we are going here. This afternoon, I propose that we clarify some common misunderstanding of this specific Marian doctrine by examining the feast itself. Secondly, the role of John Duns Scotus. And third, the theological brilliance, in fact, surprise, in his laying a solid foundation for dispelling Mary's objections and her complete freedom from sin. You should have a handout, maybe two handouts. One is a single blue sheet, and I'll come to that a little later. But the other handout has a number of pieces on it. On the back, if you put the staple in the upper right corner, is a summary of what the Catechism of the Catholic Church says about the Immaculate Conception. That's where we're going to end up in the 21st century. That's what we believe. And in that is a statement related to a solemn proclamation in 1854. But most of what I want to talk about is the early formulation of this in the middle of a tremendous set of conflicts, not just one, but multiple conflicts going on at the same time, that in my mind were all put to rest in one fell swoop by John Duns Scotus. So first, the feast itself and some of the controversy about that feast. It is a very ancient feast. In Palestine, monasteries as early as the 7th century were celebrating this specifically as the feast of the conception of Mary, sometimes referred to as the conception by Saint Anne, her mother. Over time, this celebration expanded from monasteries to cathedrals and on into local church calendars. So by the 11th century, it was widespread in the Christian East. Western celebrations are noted already, specifically in the 11th century, especially in Anglo-Saxon monasteries in what we think of today as northern France and in the southern half of the British Isles. After 1066, you remember 1066 is the invasion by the Normans, who essentially were Vikings who had been Francophiled a little bit over about 50 or 60 years, invaded England and started suppressing a lot of the Anglo-Saxon practices. The clergy were appointed by William and his successors, and they were Normans. So they started suppressing feasts, and this was one they attempted to suppress, but could not. Finally, in 1129, the Council of London, which had jurisdiction over all of the English-speaking part of the British Isles, confirmed the legitimacy of the feast for everyone in England. Interestingly, a century later, the English and the Norman students at the University of Paris adopted this feast as their patronal feast. That was the day they were going to party and skip class. Every national group did the same thing at the University of Paris. So they bannered this feast all across northern France. There was a synod in Oxford in 1222 that refused it to raise it to the rank of a holiday of obligation. Not just a holy day of obligation, it was that, but to be able to declare that it would be impossible or wrong, a violation of your faith to work, the synod came short of saying that. That's part of the historical background very briefly. It is clear that early on, well before the rise of the medieval controversies about this was practiced as a feast. It was a very popular way of talking about Mary. To talk about her is Maria Purissima in Latin. Mary Most Pure was a title that was frequently found in novenas and litanies and so on. Theologians by Scotus's time commonly held that there were several descendants of Adam who were born without the effects of original sin. Quite specifically, Jeremiah and John the Baptist and Mary, all because there is clear biblical evidence that they are born without the effects of original sin. That was common expression. There was no objection to that view. The special sanctification of these three, and perhaps others, was understood, and this was the interpretation, to occur through the mediation of the merits later to be earned by Jesus at Calvary and in the resurrection. They were not on their own merits free of original sin, but this was a gift, a blessing that was given retroactively by Jesus' activity. This sinlessness with regard to Mary soon became commonly associated with her feast on December 8 in the West. Objections to the legitimacy and the meaning, this meaning of the feast, began to emerge in the 12th century and from many, many influential voices. One of those is Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard is an important figure in his day. He was one of the great preachers of the Crusade, probably the most famous, probably the most effective preacher in England, in France, and north of the Alps throughout this period. He argues, and this is a letter that or a translation of a letter that he wrote to the canons of Lyon. Lyon is a city south, a very ancient city, first century, settled by Christians from Palestine. So it's one of the oldest sees in France. He writes to them, encouraging them to ignore these requests to raise this feast to the level of being a solemnity. In fact, he's arguing that it should be suppressed. This text is a wonderful text to review. All of the polemics, the proper ways of really arguing something and bringing it home are there. In this argument, there are at least 7 or 8 quite different reasons why they ought to ignore those requests. Essentially, what he begins with and what he ends with is, this is a novelty. We have enough novelties. We don't need any more new stuff. But he goes in the very middle of it to probably the most salient argument. Many times, as you know, if you do hermeneutics in medieval texts, the chiasmic jewel, it's very central. You begin with an opening argument, you end by closing it with that same argument, but the real argument is nestled very tightly in the center of the argument, and it is here. I say that the Virgin Mary could not be sanctified before her conception inasmuch as she did not exist. And we go, huh? I remind you that the notion of human life, individual human life beginning at conception, is fairly modern vision. That notion comes with the development of the understanding of genetics. This is not how babies were born or understood as being born in the Middle Ages. I'll come back to this point. If, all the more, she could not be sanctified in the moment of her conception by reason of the sin, which is inseparable from conception, the understanding was, again, very much influenced by Augustine, that all sexual activity bore with it concupiscence, bore with it some sense of enjoyment, bore with it a notion of sin. Part of the macula, and I'll come back to that term in a moment as well, of original sin. Then it remains to believe that she was sanctified after she was conceived in the womb of her mother. And here he expresses the common theological understanding of the 12th century that is still there in the 13th century at the University of Paris and elsewhere. That one is not a complete person at conception because the soul has not been infused into the body. Conception was understood as a purely physical thing. At some time later, the soul became present, became the form of that body. And especially with the rise of Aristotle, that now is debated in the middle of the 13th century. We will come back to that notion as well. No one, and here's the punchline of his argument, no one is given the right to be conceived in sanctity. Only the Lord Jesus was conceived of the Holy Spirit, and he alone is holy from his very conception. The notion then, especially given the gospel of this day, which was the gospel used most often in the Middle Ages, is that the conception of Jesus is a conception by the Holy Spirit. Therefore, Jesus is not affected in his humanity or his divinity by original sin. He is free from it by the power of the Holy Spirit, and quite obviously, Mary was not. She was born in the normal human way, a conception that did involve the macula, the effects of original sin. And then his argument a little bit later here is, and if we make one exception here, pretty soon we're going to have to make exceptions to her mother, we're going to have to make exceptions to her grandmother. The chain reaction is just simply going to get silly. He was quite serious in this. Look at the closing line. She cannot in any way justify a novelty invented in spite of the teaching of the church, a novelty which is the mother of imprudence, the sister of unbelief, and the daughter of like-mindedness. A wonderful rhetorical argument, very amazingly composed. St. Bernard is not the only. If we look at some of the other giants of this period, I don't have all of this in the notes that I gave you. I wanted to give you the salient ones and not reproduce a whole book for you. St. Albert the Great, I was an early fan of some of his writing, says this quite literally: we can say that the Blessed Virgin was not sanctified before animation, and the affirmative contrary to this is heresy. Animation in the Middle Ages was understood as the quickening, the time that you first feel movement in the womb, then you know the soul is there. Up until that time, there was serious doubt that the soul wasn't present. In fact, many saw that as an effect of the imposition or the infusion of the soul. St. Thomas Aquinas questions how she could have been redeemed if she had not sinned. Why bother with redemption? How can we say that she was? A logical argument, and that's one of his principal ones. St. Bonaventure, another friend of many of you, seriously reviewed an argument for the Immaculate Conception, but he ended up declaring it more common, more reasonable, and more certain that Mary was conceived in original sin. He could not find evidence supporting it. The issue by this time, in the end of the 12th century, had become whether or not it's proper to celebrate Mary's sinlessness on the feast of her conception. The argument quite commonly was, let's celebrate that on the Feast of the Incarnation, which is March 25th. The increasingly popularity of the feast of Mary's conception focused the schoolmen's attention on two questions by the middle of the 13th century. And these I want to focus on a bit more. How was Mary's sanctification to be understood? And secondly, when was she sanctified in the womb? If we look at the literature, especially at Oxford and at the University of Paris, where we had full faculties of theology operating, those were the two questions that kept recurring. How? When? In the 13th century, there were new objections to the meaning and the understanding of the feast, and they took on two specific forms, and this I think I have in your notes. Mary's sanctification took place before animation, which was at the time of the infusion of the soul. Many people started to argue that no, her sanctification started earlier than it does for most of us. This way, the soul need not ever come into contact with any of the macula. The macula are those things that are leftovers, that are the consequences of sin. Our own disposition towards pride, our own disposition towards being distracted by things that are pleasurable, the prospect of dying, a whole host of things were seen as consequences of original sin that we all inherit as children of Adam and Eve. Those are the macula. So by the middle of the 13th century, most theologians were Maculists. There were at least two appearing on the scene who were Immaculists, who said that the conception occurs without any of those attended consequences or side effects of original sin. One of those is William of Ware, who is a teacher in Oxford of John Duns Scotus. And the other is John Duns Scotus. A second issue that becomes the most focused one by the end of the 13th century is Mary's sanctification took place after animation, after the soul was infused. It was removed, or sanctification took place as a result of redemption from sin and the penalty of sin, the price of sin, into which the soul was caught when it joined with this unsanctified flesh. Notice there are a number of levels of things going on here. There are multiple levels of issues. One is body is sin, soul is not. Another is the timing mechanism. The how is this infusion taking place? How is that redemption taking place? And the one that seemed to have become the dodge issue was when. So a lot of the debate by the time we get into the 1290s is about when. They are really seriously arguing about the when more than about the how. And that's because of a number of things that happened in the 1270s, which we really don't have time to go into. John Duns Scotus, and this is my position, through the genius of his defense of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, resolved many elements, at least 5 different ones, 5 different issues that had been contentious for at least a century, in the way that he approached this doctrine and in his solution to it. There was a debate in 1304, which he decisively won. Everyone there who objected, who raised objections, cried uncle by the time of the end of the debate, angry that they could not counter and defend their own position. So the University of Paris became one of those first places where intellectually those arguments, those sub-issues started to fade. On 25 of February in 1476, a century and a half later, Pope Sixtus IV adopted the feast of the Immaculate Conception for the entire Latin Church. Later councils and popes defended it and encouraged the celebration of Mary as immaculately conceived. In this country, in the Franciscan missions in the West Coast in Mexico, you will often see the prominent role of Mary, especially in Hispanic culture today, and it's almost always the Immaculate Conception that is the primary visual image that is being used. There was still some controversy going on, even among Franciscans throughout most of this period, but on the 8th of December in 1854, Pope Pius IX issued an apostolic constitution, Ineffabilis Deus, proclaiming the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of Mary. I've given you an extract on the blue sheet of that. And I want to call your attention to a few things in that. He begins with, and the title of this document is God Ineffable. And I've not done a thorough search on this, I have not seen that title given to God, but he is used in this document. That is a Scotistic term. Whose ways are mercy and truth, whose will is omnipotence itself, another Scotistic emphasis. And whose wisdom, having foreseen from all eternity the lamentable wretchedness of the entire human race which would result from the sin of Adam, decreed by a plan hidden from the centuries to complete the first work of his goodness by a mystery, yet more wondrously sublime through the incarnation of the Word. Another Scotistic theme. If we look at the liturgy of the feast, especially the prayers, those prayers come out of Scotistic language as well. the heritage of this, and I don't know if it was always a deliberate going back to Scotus's own words, or whether the draft of this document was written by a Franciscan, perhaps, who did go back to those words. But they do show very directly, 400 years later, the impact of the very words that Scotus uses. With this proclamation, at least in the Western Church, I don't know about the Eastern Church, most of those controversies that were part of the controversies of the late 13th century have just simply gone away. What's remarkable to me is how closely Scotus's theology is echoed in that history, and especially in that doctrinal formulation. And it shows up as well in the liturgical practice itself. What had perhaps started as a common grassroots piety of the faithful, and later the liturgical practices in many parts of the world, triggered controversy in the intellectual or the dogmatic side of the development of the church in the 13th century, and then was resolved, in large part, I would argue, by Scotus. Part 2. I'm almost caught up with my own type schedule. If you look at your notes, I've given you a good deal more information in part 2 so that I can skip it, knowing that we might have some limited time for discussion this way. What do we know about this John from the town of Duns, who was a Scot? In fact, at Oxford, he is referred to as John Duns, John of Duns. He's not referred to as Scotus, or the Latin word for the Scot, until he gets to Paris. Apparently there was no confusion. There was only one John from Duns at Oxford, and everyone knew who he was. At Paris, they didn't know that. There's an ancient poem, and I found this on the sarcophagus in Cologne, that is actually miscopied by someone in Cologne to give Cologne a slight advantage. But I use that as a kind of an outline for some notes on his life that I think you might find very, very helpful. And it's a 4-part thing. In Latin, it's Scotia me genuit, Anglia me docuit, Gallia me recepit, and Colonia me tenet. The only verb in the present tense is the last one. And he is still there in Cologne. Scotland brought him forth. He was raised, was probably 12 or 14 when he left Scotland to go to Oxford. England taught him. He was a master, not a regent master, but a master at the University of Oxford. Also taught at the University of Cambridge a number of times. France received him for a time, although the king didn't, and eventually went on to Cologne, where he died in 1308. That sketch is there for you to look at. We can talk about some of those details if you want after the talk itself. I want to add a couple of quick comments in very summary fashion about both his spirituality and his theological vision. As I've grown to love this man and what he did, I've also come to appreciate how he did it. Contemporary observations and reports about him refer to him frequently as a pious friar, and the one outstanding trait that made him stand out from the rest of his community was his absolutely spontaneous and unhesitating kind of obedience. If someone gave him a direction or even a suggestion, he simply went and did it right then, including something that we stumbled into about 5 years ago, as Tim Nolan was working on the final version of the edited text of his offering the commentary on the second book of the sentences, which Scotus rendered last. He didn't take them in order. Suddenly, Scotus's handwriting stops and someone else's takes over. That bothered Tim tremendously. As we met in a conference about 3 years ago, a good friend of mine from Los Angeles And I said, well, we know why. He got the letter from the Minister General to go to Cologne and take up the new position, and what he did was he dropped it. He didn't even take the manuscript with him. He went off to the new job. That is typical of Scotus in many other things that he does as well, or did as well. There are several reports of him being a man of many ecstasies. One report that is well documented because it has more than one written source was that he had a vision on Christmas night in 1299 at the Oxford Friary, and in that vision, the Blessed Virgin appeared to him with the baby and gave him the baby to hold, and he and the baby played. Notice the central vision in that and in his theology, as a matter of fact, is always the baby. It is always Jesus. The mother is important because of Jesus. Scotus also, in his theological vision, is very genuinely a Franciscan, taught by a chain of Franciscans at Oxford, influenced perhaps somewhat indirectly because he never knew him, by Bonaventure and some of the others, the giants on the continent. But if we look at all that he does, what we see is that it all comes back to his spirituality, very amazingly so. He was the innovator of the notion of private property, first instance of that in recorded history. And he attributes it to Francis and the notion of poverty. Tie private property to poverty once, and you get a different notion of how you might want to extend that into your economic theory. His notion of mutuality flows very directly from Francis' emphasis on brotherly fellowship. His hekchetas, the thisness, which was clearly an invention of his, is inspired by Francis' focus on the present moment, the present instance, each individual as an individual. He's also a son of Bonaventure in many ways, his Christ-centeredness throughout. And he does very much develop on the notion of the primacy of Christ, which is a distinctive Franciscan doctrinal teaching in this time period that comes down to the present age in very significant ways. The last word I want to say about him particularly is his piety, his holiness, his prayer life is always connected to his writing and his work. He was certainly not schizoid, as many of us are, where we separate our lives into parts, where we compartmentalize it. It doesn't happen. In his writing, as he's writing something, periodically, you have these little prayers just pop out. A number of years ago, Sister Anita asked me if I was collecting them, and I started to collect them, and I thought, no, that wouldn't be right. We would be tearing them out of the context in which they occurred. In him, his prayers and what he was working on intellectually are happening together. They aren't stop and start from one to the other. So I abandoned that. His defense of the Immaculate Conception, the third and last part. The argument that he faced most often at Oxford and at Paris by most of his colleagues, by most of his contemporaries, by those in the School of Arts and then later in the School of Theology. The argument would run like this. This had become the received argument of the Maculists by the end of the 13th century. And I give this to you pretty much as it is in the text. Mary was free of original sin in the womb before her birth, not necessarily from conception. Mary was truly a descendant of Adam. That is, Mary was naturally conceived by her parents. Therefore, there were macula. Anyone who is seminally conceived, and that's a term I do find once in a while in medieval literature, would inherit the essential guilt, the macula, and all of those effects of Adam's sin at the moment of being conceived. Jesus was exempt from the effects of the macula of such sin by reason of the fact that his birth was miraculous. His mother remained a virgin, He was born of the power of the Holy Spirit, not of the power of man. If Mary were without macula at her conception, she would have no need for a Redeemer. And so, trump card, Jesus would not be the Redeemer of all people. Therefore, Mary must have contracted the macula of original sin at conception and must have been sanctified sometime later in the womb before her birth. That was the standard argument. And notice it involves several elements. One can argue what Scotus brings to the generation after Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure is not a new synthesis of faith and reason. I would not propose that at all, nor would Scotus agree with it. But what does happen is a paradigm shift, not a novelty, an important paradigm shift, a resorting of some of what was being held true even by the Maculists, which must have been why they were so stunned. He was not taking a contradictory position, he was doing something else. In addition to being very well trained in Aristotelian logic, and he was amazing in his argument form, the story goes that he never, ever lost a debate. He was the champion of Oxford that they sent to the continent to clean up the problems over there. He also ignores Aristotle's natural philosophy in favor of Christianizing his own metaphysics. That's an important difference, even from some of the earlier Franciscans. And he recenters his theological focus on God and less on the human condition. Here are some key principles that you can find in many, many different places in Scotus's writing. Metaphysics is basically about being, that it's more fundamental than essence. And being he uses as a verb, not a noun. It's not that there are beings, there is being, the doing of existing. He recenters his discussion about God in the theology of being. In fact, in his Quodlibet, the only one that he did at Paris, he begins the discussion of the first principle in talking about the scene of Moses on Mount Sinai. And he's struck by the answer that Moses gets when Moses asks the question about one who exists, a being, as a noun, and he gets the answer in Hebrew in a verb. I am. I am who am in Hebrew. Scotus sees that quite clearly as a clue that he builds the whole rest of his theology of God around. He uses all the forms of the verb to be in a univocal form. Everyone else, especially Aquinas, is famous for talking about being in an analogous sense, that the qualities and characteristics of God we as creatures share only in an analogous way. Scotus says, not so. We share them because it is the Creator living and operating in us. But he never gets to pantheism. He never crosses that bridge. He talks about the essence of God lying in God's action, not in God's knowledge, not in God's planning. One that he's very adamant about is referring to God as his will in a very radically free way, that no way can God's will ever be limited by anything, even by God. And it's certainly antecedent to any kind of knowing. Our age, very, very clearly in our age, our culture says that knowing precedes doing. Scotus says, no, it's the other way around. God does what he knows. The knowledge was not pre-existent. His theology is very Christocentric. He does not attribute anthropomorphic notions to God. He notices sin is to be located in the soul, not the body. That's a dramatic shift from his colleagues, from his contemporaries, because sin is a function of the will, not a function of appetite. And finally, he sees original sin in the Anselmian sense of privation of original justice. On that handout, I gave you two quotes out of Scotus. One is the one that is most often used and is referred to directly in the proclamation of the doctrine in 1854. The other is the fuller question. The first is this, and I want to spend a few minutes and parse this out a little bit. To answer the question, how was Mary conceived? Scotus's response is, I say that God could have brought it about that one, she was never in original sin, or two, that she was in sin for only an instant, or three, that she was in sin for some period of time, and at the last instance of that time was purged by Jesus' redeeming activity. He goes on to say, which of these three possibilities is the case? God knows. But if the authority of the church or the authority of Scripture does not contradict it, then it seems probable, that is his word, that what is more excellent should be attributed to Mary. Notice his argument. His argument is whatever could be the best explanation, not in terms of time, not in terms of human rationality, but in terms of God's activity, God probably did it the best way possible. And the best way possible was not to let her fall into sin in the first place. Option one seems like a really, really more glorious thing for God to have done. There's a whole phrase on this that was developed not by Scotus, but by one of his followers later that we can come back to. The logical structure of that argument is fairly unique and perhaps original with Scotus, if not William of Ware. When he does in some disputations later that are not in English, unfortunately, what we get, I think, is the fuller account of the story. The full question, the really big, complete question that Scotus is answering in those objections and responses that had been going on all day. At the end of the day, this is what he says. We can therefore say that it was possible that the Blessed Virgin was not conceived in original sin. This assertion does not diminish in any way the universal redemption of her Son as we have outlined above. We can furthermore confirm this, since the Passion of Christ was immediately and principally ordered to delete original sin as well as actual sin in such a way that all the Trinity, since it had the foresight of the merits and the Passion of Christ, applied them to the Virgin and preserved her from all actual sin and also from original sin. Scotus' turn of focus is really subtle. He won't let you end up in a rational reason. The Maculists had charged that if Mary were conceived without sin, there would be no macula to be removed, no sin price to be paid, so she would have had no need for a redeemer. Jesus would not be, her own Son would not be her redeemer. Scotus, notice, ignores the misplaced notions of metaphysical time and motion and counters that Mary needs a redeemer more than anyone. That's subtle. that doesn't make sense on first blush. His insight is that she, more than any of Adam's other children, needed a more perfect act of redemption because she was protected from sin and its macula from her first instance of existence. While she was preserved from slavery to sin, she still needed redemption more because she was conceived in the natural way and lived in the natural condition, surrounded by original sin. More than Adam and Eve, who were born in an innocent position, without macula. She's born into a world full of it. And because it never touched her, her redemption is different than ours. The gift of prevention of sin without destroying the freedom of the Immaculate One is a greater gift than baptism and its restoration of sanctifying grace to the soul by remitting original and personal sin. Let me say that again. The gift of prevention, to prevent Mary from falling into sin, requires a greater personal grace than to be pulled out of sin, as the rest of us are. The gift of prevention of sin without destroying the freedom of the person, of Mary, is a greater gift than baptism and its restoration of sanctifying grace. Being protected from falling into sin is a greater act than remitting sin and its spiritual consequences. We could go on, and I could give you some of the history of some of what happened immediately after that debate and several other debates. Some of the Franciscans and how they did some variations on that, how that develops through the Renaissance and on into the Reformation is a story that needs to be told sometime. We know the end of the story. We know what we believe. We know what is in our own catechism. Our devotion to Mary expresses and is expressed in our belief that she is the Mother of God, that as mother, she is virgin, that she was conceived immaculately, was assumed into heaven as its queen and the mother of us, the church. Tomorrow we will rejoice again in Mary's being more blessed than we are, more redeemed than we are. Thank you. We have time for any questions or rebuttals or contradictions or whatever discussion you'd like to raise. I have a mic. Do we need?
I forget the name of the fellow who lectured on the Council of Trent not very many months ago. I read his book, which was very good, but I don't recall this subject coming up in that council. Is that something that they had to hash over, Mary?
The celebration of her feast and the celebration of her as an Immaculate Conception had been very common. That it was not so controversial at Trent. That was not a point of difference between many of the Protestant objections to what was going on at Rome.
So Martin Luther didn't, that wasn't one of his?
No, in fact, Martin Luther very much adheres to most of the Marian theology. Adheres, in my understanding, to virgin birth and so on, that was not an issue. I can be corrected on that, but I've not stumbled into that being the case. In fact, Muslims also celebrate Mary as immaculate. By the 7th century, this was fairly widespread in the world. It becomes a controversy in the 13th century when we start thinking about it.
I was wondering, when we speak of the Immaculate Conception, are we to consider that word as a negation of macula, or
No,
Normally
not a negation, but it's the im part would be without macula. It would be negative in the sense that macula is absent.
I was thinking of sin or some other other prefix, but a negation of it. Okay.
It's a sort of negative, but it's the absence of it rather than the contradiction of it. Grace would be the contradiction of it.
So, Dr. Comfort, so you mentioned some of the objectors. But during his lifetime, was there any sense that some of these theologians were coming around to his way of thinking about Mary as immaculately conceived during his lifetime?
His English confreres did. They agreed with him. Many of his French Franciscan fellows disagreed with him. And they often sided with a fellow that he had a lot of respect for. I'm not sure that they were actually contemporaries. There was a man by the name of Henry of Ghent, who probably comes as close to him on some of the issues. And one of those issues is the timing argument. There's a strong affection for Mary, especially from the British Isles, and especially from Italy. But whether or not we want to see her as an exception to the rest of the human race was not agreeable. And part of the hang-up that would not be a hang-up today is their notion of first you are conceived, and there's physiological development. You have a vegetative soul, and then you have an animal soul, but you don't get the human soul until the 3rd month. That was so widely accepted as a scientific description that there was a lot of time play. Henry of Ghent said it had to be within instants it had to be as early as possible, so that the first time human physical structure takes place, that's when the grace of Jesus' redemption of freeing her from original sin occurred. But he was still assuming that there was that physical inheritance in the physical body. That was the crux that Scotus actually bypasses completely. He doesn't answer that question. He answers a bigger one. That just makes that question no longer a controversy. So in some senses, what I see in the impact in some of his later detractors is that they want to go back and resurrect one or another of those issues that his answer just simply bypasses. It's the beauty of his argument in some ways. And it comes out of his spirituality. It doesn't come out of his reading of Aristotle.
If you wouldn't mind expanding on something that you noted just in passing, what was the role that Scotus played in the origin of the notion of private property, and how was this connected with St. Francis himself?
I'm drawing the connection. Scotus doesn't explicitly connect it. There is in some of his political writing the notion that there is not only community property, but that some people, because of their work, because of their need, because of their role in life, have the right to make decisions about property. So it flows out of his notion of human free will, and human free will needs some of the physical wherewithal to be exercised. Otherwise, human free will that cannot be exercised, if it's just a wish, then it's not really a decision. So there has to be physical availability, control over physical things, if I'm actually to exercise my will. And that's the central part of where his notion of individual property, what we would consider property rights, flows from. There is a book that deals with that, if you want. Ellen Walter, a teacher of mine, and some others have documented and have pulled those citations out if you're interested. But it comes more out of his notion of human freedom of will than it comes out of God. It's not that God gives us private property. It's just that it's obviously necessary that we have it. Otherwise, will is meaningless.
I enjoyed your presentation very much. Thank you. Sometimes I wonder, a Protestant might say, well, okay, we know that Jesus was free from sin because he is God. But why would God bother to make his mother free of sin? I mean, okay, she's a normal person. Let's say she had sin. That's fine as long as Jesus doesn't have sin. So why would God bother to make Mary free of sin? Does the church or Scotus argue from fittingness? It would be more fit for Mary to be free of original sin because she is Jesus' mother. You know, sometimes I wonder about that. If you could speak to that. What's the whole? What's the big deal about the whole dogma? What's so important about it?
There are 2 points there. One, what I was calling the paradigm shift, the shift to a new focus, to a larger issue. That larger issue is God's absolute freedom. Another related notion is his presentation. I'll come back to your question, but this might be a help to clarify in a parallel way. He talks about the motive. Why does God send the Son into the world? The common understanding then, as it had been part of the descending Christology throughout much of Western culture, was because man sinned, God needs to fix it. His creation is somehow tarnished. So God sends his Son, who through his own full obedience and death now earns and pays the death price and frees us, so in a sense fixes it. And Scotus says, well, that's true. That certainly does happen. It did happen. And that is a good motive. But a better answer is Jesus was coming anyway. He says this quite explicitly, that the incarnation was planned from the very beginning apart from what human beings were going to do with free will. He was going to come as the fullest possible example of what it means to be human, because joined with divinity, that humanness can now be perfect. So that Jesus becomes the model of all of creation and becomes the kind of end model that we should be focusing on, so that not only are we freed from sin, but we grow into Christ. We become like Trinity in us. Are you with me? Which is more than just getting the slate clean. We actually develop now as individuals and as society. And Mary is part of that story. To show that God can do this, he does it for his mother. He prevents her from ever being in sin and gives her the added redemptive grace of how to live in a world of sin without being tarnished by it. That's his central argument. And the basic argument, as I gave you in the first version of it, was if God could do this, why not? It makes very good sense. It's more glorious. It makes for a better creator to do that than for a creator that has to respond to, that becomes subject to or a slave to human free will.
So in a sense, she's like a model of our unification.
She's a model of how a non-God could live in the world without sinning.
So it's not just looking at it as a model of she's free from sin, but looking at it from a positive viewpoint of this is
Right.
This is a model of our fullness of deification, our fullness of what we can be.
What we can be, right.
Okay.
It's not that she deserved it. In fact, he argues very explicitly, we cannot say that Mary had a right to being immaculately conceived. It's not a right, it's a gift. God created it. He did not have to do it. Just as he did not have to send his Son into the world to save us. He could have done it another way. But he chose to do it this way, is Scotus' argument.
Interesting, thank you.
It's a different angle. It doesn't need justification if it's mystery, is another way that he puts that at times.
Dr. Comfer, a question. The freedom that Scotus is attributing to God, and I'm speaking with incomplete knowledge. I'm not a philosopher or a student of philosophy, but is it William Ockham that there's an argument that he kind of attributed to God an absolute freedom, that he could have decided that what we consider now wrong or irrational to be in fact good? Is this the kind of freedom that Scotus was talking about?
Not quite. He and Ockham do share some things, but Ockham goes off in a direction that Scotus did not appreciate even when they were both at Oxford. For him, God's will is always oriented to the beautiful, to the best that anything can be, rather than the arbitrariness of freedom means I can do it this way, I can take one of two choices, and both of those choices are equally available to me. Occam goes in that direction. Scotus went with the former, that God is drawn only. If God can be predestined, it's only because perfect goodness presents itself to him, which would be himself. He sees that happening in the Trinity. So in a sense, it's a different notion of this radical freedom. It cannot be contradicted even by its creature. And again, the incarnation argument was, we can't hold God hostage and make God do something. You know, we're going to fix this world so it's broken, so you have to come and fix it. Scotus says, no, that doesn't make sense. That's not the kind of God that created this world. He created us, and this is the mystery, he created us to be free, to sin, but it didn't make God change his plan. And the same thing is true of his mother. So he would not expect, in answer to your question again, that there would be a reason that would trap God into having to make his mother immaculately conceived. He chose to do it. It was gift.
Could you speak a bit more about how the Muslims view Mary? I have a friend who's Muslim, very devout, and said one time to me that there were more references to the Mary, Virgin Mary, in the Quran than there are in the Bible. References to Mary. But I was just wondering, what do they pick up on, and is it like the Immaculate Conception?
There are a number, and I'm not sure the count, how many times Mary might be in both. That could well be true. I don't know. Because Mary's name does appear many times, not just explicitly, but also by reference. Mother of God is a favorite term. Virgin Mother is found, and it's very explicitly expressed in a number of places in the Quran, that she is both virgin and mother, and most pure, without sin. Uses a number of those phrases are there. It's in the Quran.
Muhammad wrote the Word of God, but did he write that after Scotus?
That's 7th century.
Oh.
Most of it's appeared by the end of the 7th century. Unless I got my century wrong. I think that's right.
I was going to turn the direction a little bit and ask you, what do you think Scotus's relationship to modern philosophy is? Since I think you say a few things that, to me, that make him sound very contemporary. One being that he thinks of essence, existence preceding essence. He thinks of, he's not in favor of Aristotelian natural science, and he Christianizes metaphysics. These would be three, I think, directions that we could characterize, I think, contemporary and modern metaphysics. And I was wondering what kind of logics and hermeneutic structure would take place. And I think you've spoken about it in a sense.
Let me give you the quick answer. The hermeneutic is going to be more than we could probably handle in one discussion. I'm very much influenced by Etienne Gilson, who loves Scotus. In fact, at one place he says, most of the people who object to Scotus just haven't read him, and most of those who have read him don't understand him anyway. But very much struck. And if you remember, I don't know if you're familiar with Gilson, but Gilson is the one who, in a sense, rehabilitates Aquinas in the middle of the 20th century and emphasizes something that's in Aquinas that often is forgotten by other Thomists. The emphasis that Aquinas says, only of God can you use the infinitive of the form of the word to be. All others, it's only a participle at best, maybe an adjective. And he also says that existence, reality exists before the what of any real thing exists. So it's not novel. He had never heard Aquinas. Aquinas had left Paris 20 years before Scotus got there. But he certainly is adopting that notion. I don't know how much of it was in the water at Paris. I don't know if Aquinas' influence had survived the 1270s, because his stuff was banned from Paris. So how he got that and where he got it from, I'm not quite sure. And I don't find it in William of Ware. I don't find it in Grosseteste. I don't find it in the other Oxford Franciscans. So he picked it up somewhere. But it is a clear emphasis. The other shoe is that he uses all forms of the word to be in a univocal sense, not an analogical sense, which is a pretty scary thing to do in metaphysics. That changes a lot of things, as you're probably very well aware. I don't know if that answered the question, but the hermeneutic would have to be, when you're going to talk about the nature of God, how are you going to do that when all the words, all the images, all the language, all the understanding we have is all from limited reality. Everything that we know has some sort of limit on it. So as soon as we are talking about someone who is infinite, how do we justify that talk? How do we make sense of that? So it's in a sense, a philosophical option. You can do it univocally or you can do it analogically, but each of those is going to suffer. Neither one of them is going to be a perfect way. And I don't know how you could justify one, but I would choose to agree with Scotus.
Did Pius IX address and or adopt any of the philosophical aspects that you talked about of Scotus's reasoning?
Yes, I broke out of that whole decree. The decree is about 5 or 6 times longer than what I copied out for you. I copied out 3 portions, and a lot of the phrasing is Scotistic language. I pointed out a few of those. I can go back over those if you'd like. But it's quite clear that he was aware of that. Modern popes also have read Scotus. John Paul II, when he received, I think it was the 20th volume of the critical edition of Scotus's work done by the Franciscans at Karachi, gave an address, and he goes down through and he narrates in his own philosophy and theology those things that he finds himself indebted to Scotus. The residual effect of Scotus is that I think a lot of those notions and ideas catch ground at the end of the 13th century. You may not be aware that Thomas is not being read at Paris, not being read at Cologne until the 15th century. He's a persona non grata. Bonaventure, for reasons I still do not understand, is not being read in the 15th and 14th century. He's revived in the 16th century. In that gap of 200 or 300 years, it's Scotus and Scotus's students, and some of them are harebrained. Some of them go off in a lot of different directions. It's Scotus's key ideas that feeds into the Renaissance and into the Reformation on both sides. And that's a part of our history that we don't put in our books. I didn't find that in books. I just kept stumbling over these facts. And then Scotus's fame is eclipsed, especially by Jansenism and some of the other movements in the 16th century. Scotus is out of, he's no longer part of the fad. There's a book recently, I think it was just published last year, by Brad Gregory. I think it was last year. You have the title of it? The Unintended Reformation. And his thesis throughout is, in the first chapter, he lays out a number of things that he sees as ideas that genetically keep popping up, that they're in our Western culture's genes, and they keep popping up, and some of that is Scotus. It's not cause and effect. It's not just a linear kind of effect. And Brad is right at Notre Dame, so one of these days, when I finish his book, I'm I'm sure we're going to have a long talk, because so far I'm not agreeing that all the things that he's laying at Scotus's feet maybe should be laid at Scotus's feet, but this is not a new idea. That almost in any of us who are students of history of the last 2,000 years, we find an idea in the 20th century that sounds really fresh and new. We can find other occurrences of it in the past, maybe in a different context, maybe in a different strength. But we like to think that we're original.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience and your attention, and I hope you'll join me in thanking Dr. Comfort again for a fascinating lecture. With that, I bid you a good afternoon, and we will be reconvening our series, as I mentioned at the outset, in January across the street in the North Campus with Sister Felicity on the 5 feasts of the child Jesus, and I hope to see you then. Thank you.
One last thing I was going to do if we had our technology together today. There's a video that was done. Ignatius Press, I think, is one distributor of this. It's an Italian piece with English subtitles, and it's about Scotus and his defense in 1204 or 1304 of the Immaculate Conception. It's about an hour and a half, but you will find this around. It's well worth your time. It's well worth your pocketbook.